Okay, once again, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Heidi Marshall. I am the coordinator of our online campus writing center, and I'm going to be taking you through tonight's session, which is all about moving from annotation to synthesis. So the purpose of tonight's session is really to work with those of you who are moving from that stage in your writing process, whether you're a master's or doctoral student. We've been used to writing what are called annotated bibliographies, and now you're thinking about crafting what is known as the literature review. So, quick overview of tonight's session. We're going to talk a little bit about what annotation is, the purpose that it does serve. It does serve a very critical purpose as we're gathering our literature, being able to understand the sources that we're then going to integrate into synthesis. So we'll look at the distinctions between annotation and synthesis, and then we're really going to focus a lot on how to achieve synthesis within a document or an essay such as a literature review. So you are going to hear me reference the literature review a fair amount. That doesn't mean that these concepts are exclusive to writing a literature review. That's just the most common area that we see in graduate school where you're going to be integrating the concepts of synthesis. So that's the term that I'll be using, but keep in mind that this is applicable across written assignments. So anytime that you are melding information from two or more sources, what you're really doing is synthesizing that information. So what is annotation? I'm sure if you are attending the session, likely you have written an annotated bibliography, if not in your current program, that at some point in your educational career, you've written an annotated bibliography. And annotation is essentially a summary, a very detailed summary of the source. They can be longer at times, shorter at other times, but for the most part, you're summarizing the main concepts of a source. You're really, especially when we couch this in the context of a literature review, in that annotation, you want to make sure that you're including enough information to rationalize the inclusion of that source in your work. So from your annotation as a reader, and certainly you as the writer should know, this is why I'm choosing to use this source, why I see it as valuable, integral to my own work. And usually a single annotation is compiled again into what we see as an annotated bibliography. These have great utility, and there is a very specific reason why students are tasked with writing multiple annotated bibliographies, sometimes in their programs, as they build up to that capstone work and build up to the dissertation process. It helps you organize your thoughts about your sources. It helps you identify which sources you are going to use, again, in that greater source. It is a pre-work of a literature review, but it is not in and of itself a literature review. And I'm going to talk about some of the common errors that we see, but I want to mention it up front that probably one of the most common errors that we see in the literature review is that what students essentially have done is done a big copy and paste of their annotated bibliography into the literature review, removing those reference citations, obviously, but where we get a literature review that is blocks of annotation rather than true synthesis. So that's what I really want to help you overcome in tonight's session. So now we've looked at what annotation is, let's talk a little bit about what synthesis is. So synthesis is an integrated, critical representation of the most relevant and current research that's obviously been published to date. Whoops, sorry about that. The most current published knowledge on the topic, it combines your summary. So you will pull on that summary that you spent so much time on in that annotated bibliography. You're also going to be adding your own paraphrasing, your analysis, comparisons, contrasts, and evaluations. Essentially, you're adding your own critical thought to those annotations to present a cohesive, holistic picture of your topic. So here's just a quick example of what synthesis might look like on the page. So we say Marshall, I've cited that, has suggested that X is true. Rasmussen has also argued that X is true, but has pointed out that the effects of X may be different than those suggested by Marshall, noting McGrath also showed variations in how the effects of X could be influenced by, and so forth. So you notice here I have three different sources. I'm not simply summarizing those sources. I'm really pulling together the main concepts of those articles and how they play against one another or how they complement one another. That's our goal in synthesis, is to look at all of the information that we've compiled. And once you've done all this reading and you've composed that annotated bibliography, you are now the expert on that topic. You've done what's called exhausting the research or exhausting the literature. You sort of essentially know all there is to know about this particular topic. And now you need to convey to the reader how it all fits together. And to remember too that in your literature review particularly, it is an essay and it's a persuasive essay. What you're doing in that literature review is persuading me, the reader, your audience, your broader audience, that's what I mean by me, the reader, is your broader audience, that there is a gap that needs filling and that you as the researcher are going to fill that gap. So in order to make that case, to be persuasive, we need to show that you've exhausted the ways that all of the previous literature fits together, and that there is indeed a gap. So remember, that's your purpose here. So we have to say, how do all of these sources play together? How is it all coming together? So in short, well-synthesized paper, so a paper that we see, a literature review that's really successful, should leave your reader with a holistic sense that the writer, that is you, or the researcher, has conveyed his or her own new ideas and has drawn on a chorus of support. One thing that I really love about synthesis, this concept of synthesis and the literature review in general, is that if we had a room of 20 people, all well educated, even all in the same program, and I handed all 20 people a reference list, and that reference list was exactly the same. You know, we'll say there's 30 articles on there. All of those 20 people read all of the same 30 articles and then all wrote their own synthesized essay, is that every one of those essays would be different. That we all come in with our own program expertise, our career expertise, cultural background, all of our sort of previous diverse backgrounds come into how we interpret the literature review. And that's what really makes it very exciting. And where I hear a lot of students say, well, you know, we don't really get to have any of our own ideas in our dissertation. We're just paraphrasing what other people have said or other people have researched. And that is true, but the way you paraphrase it and the way you bring it all together is your own voice. That is where you get to have your own unique perspective. And again, I think that's the really exciting part about doing this, but that's difficult to do. It's not an easy task. So let's talk about some tricks to make it a little bit easier. So in an annotation, you are a passive reporter of ideas. Right? Again, you're simply summarizing what somebody else has said. But in synthesis, you are an active participant in the academic conversation. So again, it's where you get to say, here is my perspective on all of this existing literature. Here's my point of view. Here is how I perceive it all coming together. I like to think of this as being sort of 3 different characters in the process. At the outset, and really throughout, because doing literature reviews, doing research, bringing ideas together is a very inductive process. So much of these roles are ongoing. You're sort of constantly coming back to the from one to the other. But first and foremost, you're a detective. You've already identified a research problem, right? If you're not working on a dissertation, then that research problem, we could equate that to your assignment parameters, that you have something from which you are working. And now you're going to be drawing on key ideas from the literature about that problem. And you're trying to connect ideas to form a logical narrative. Much like detectives find information, they gather clues to form a logical narrative about what most likely happened. So we are trying to connect the dots and formulate what is the most likely outcome of all of the existing literature, what needs to be filled, what is missing. We're an analyst. We have to then begin to turn on sort of that other, part of your brain, if you will, where you begin to think really logically about the ideas that you're trying to convey. So you're building your case about connections between key ideas, and you're trying to persuade your reader, but we're doing that not necessarily, there are a few different written persuasive techniques, and in the literature review and in synthesis, what we're really doing is we're tapping into logic. We want to tap into our reader's logic. That's how we're going to be persuasive in this essay, in this synthesized essay. We're also what I call a puzzle master, where we're fitting pieces together to reveal the whole. So that's very akin to the definition I just had up, is that you're looking at all these different pieces, and again, you're bringing it in to form a holistic, unified essay. Very first step in this process, going back to being that detective, is that you have to be able to connect the dots. That means that you really need to critically understand what it is you're reading. Because if you don't have a very solid, very critical understanding of every source that you're incorporating in your synthesis, you run the risk of misrepresenting information, being confusing to your reader, leaving out really critical pieces of information. So you want to be sure that you understand every single thing that you've read and that you're including in that literature review. I'm going to take you through relatively quickly here what's called the SQ3R, also sometimes known as the SQ4R critical reading model, and it has several steps. The first step is scanning your text. So when you're ready to begin putting together we'll just say even an annotated bibliography, but somewhere where you are going to be needing to read very critically because you're going to have to convey those ideas in some parameter. The first step you're going to want to do is scan the text for organization. You want to note publication information, the date of publication, author associations, any other information that's going to inform you first and foremost about the source's accuracy and relevancy. Relevancy particularly has to do with the date of publication as well as the dates of the research about which you are reading. Because those are not always synonymous, right? Sometimes we're publishing articles years after we've conducted research. So you want to make sure that what you're reading is relevant. In your literature review, we're looking at sources 5 years as a general guideline. So you want to have a really good case. If you have to go older than 5 years, that you have a really good rationale, because when we say you're exhausting the current literature, really what we're talking about is 5 years or sooner. So you want to make sure that source is accurate, that it's relevant. You also want to scan and make sure you have an understanding of how the author has put the article together, that you understand the vocabulary, the diction. Sometimes there's really industry-specific jargon in some of what we read, so that you're understanding all of that. If you don't understand it, that you're taking the steps to find out the definitions of those words or terms that you're less familiar with. And you also want to take note of any biases that the authors might have. So that's our very first step, is we're scanning. We're just making sure we can check off in our checklist that we feel that this source is accurate and it's relevant, that it is definitely something that's going to play a role in my literature review. Then what you really want to do is question, and this becomes very important as you get later on in the literature review process. So later on in the stages where maybe, let's say you've already have 60 articles and you're just looking to fill a few gaps in your literature review. Like maybe your chair has come back to you and said, I really want you to investigate this theory or this particular methodology. So you're going to have an intention in what you read. I relate this a lot if you've ever done a yoga class. Yoga instructors will often ask you to set an intention for the class. So I say, before you sit down and read an article, set an intention for reading that article. What questions do you have relating to it? All right, what are you expecting to get out of that? How do you expect the source to relate to the other sources you have already read? So again, do you have a very specific purpose? Are you looking now for counter argument because maybe your literature review is a little bit one-sided and you've heard from readers that you need to incorporate more points of view. So maybe that's an intention that you have. So do you have questions about the author's purpose, how it's going to align to your own research? Or again, are you reading that because you're interested in the methodology and the sample size and the population that author studied? So you're setting that intention by asking questions. And then, of course, we can't get around it. We do actually have to read the article itself and take notes. I recommend you do those simultaneously, and that when you sit down to read that article, that you do so with enough time to read the article in its entirety. I know sometimes that is not feasible, but rather than being in the habit of reading 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, that particularly when you have a very clear intention, that you're setting aside enough time to really absorb what it is you're reading. You want to make sure as you're reading it, you're identifying, of course, the main ideas, any details that support those main ideas, that you're taking note of any of those questions. If you find answers to those questions that you had going in, that you're taking note on that. And just remember, reading for comprehension does take time. Don't feel pressure to read quickly. I know, I mean, doing this kind of work is time consuming, and we just really can't get around that. But make sure you take notes. I don't have a slide tonight on note-taking practices. I am of the belief that that's a very personal process. We all have a system that we tend to default to, that we think works for us. Me personally, I like a combination of sticky notes, of comments in the margin. I tend to print out everything I'm reading and I highlight it. But that's my own personal style. And I think, you know, what works for you is the best method for you. So find what works. Where you can go back and recall you've built a practice where you are able to recall the information that you read. After you've done that, after you've taken those notes, and you've probably heard this before, this is something that even at the undergraduate level gets hammered in quite a bit when it comes to study practices and study skills, is that once you've read that source and you've taken those notes, you want to go back and reread your notes. Say, did I answer, you know, go back and ask yourself, was I able to answer the questions? Okay, is there anything from this source that I know I want to directly quote, or I certainly need to paraphrase in my own work? Did that source come up? Did you come up with any new questions after reading that? All right, now that we've done that, what we need to do is make sure that we have a critical understanding, but we're going to now take it one step further and think about, how does this now compare to the rest of what I've read? So you're going to begin now that process of analyzing, comparing, and evaluating this source in the context of everything else that you've already read. At the very early stages, this process might come a little bit later. So let's say, I mean, if you're only 2 articles into reading literature for your literature review, you're not really going to be able to get into the weeds of this step too much, right? You do need to have a good base of articles of read and a set of notes before you can really get into this. But once you do, you're going to find, you'll find it happens relatively naturally, that even as you're reading, you're going to begin that analysis process. You're going to begin comparing. Your notes will likely have some evaluation, some comparison or contrast in them. And to keep in mind, now what you're doing is we're moving beyond that critical reading into critical thinking practices. So now we've done that work, and if you are a good note taker, or the better note taker you are, I will say, the easier the writing process becomes. Okay, so the more notes you take, the more thorough you are in that stage, the easier it is to write, because you've already done quite a bit of writing. So what I have here is now the critical writing process. These are sort of stages in the writing process. We go, obviously you need to start with understanding the assignment. I always recommend that writers begin from an outline, that you take your notes, and from your notes, you craft an outline. Then you begin the writing process. You're going to draft, you're going to revise. Likely the draft and revise is going to be circular. You're going to be going through that multiple times. You're going to draft, you're going to have a draft of your literature review. You're going to submit it to your chair. They're going to send it back. You're going to submit it to another reader. They're going to send it back. You'll revise. Maybe you submit it to the Online Campus Writing Center. We provide feedback, send it back, you revise, right? So that this is a multiple step process. The very last thing you're going to do is proofread it, looking for little errors. We don't worry too much about that in our drafting and revision. And then finally, you submit. So I am going to pause if anyone wants to take a stab at and there's no right or wrong, but just what would you perceive to be the 2 most important steps in this process? You can feel free to throw that in the chat or in the question area. What we would say in the Writing Center, what we perceive to be, again, those 2 most critical steps would be outlining, as I mentioned already, and the revision. right? This is where good writing happens, is that the more organized you are going into your writing, the stronger that writing is going to be. And the more time you dedicate to revision, the stronger your writing is going to be. Every good writer, from Stephen King through, I would say, so I have my master's degree is in creative writing. So I spent a lot of my initial graduate years just learning the craft of writing. And so you read a lot of books by writers about writing. And in every one of those books about writing, about how to become a good writer, is the advice that you must embrace the crummy first draft. That no matter what, the first draft that you write of anything is not your best writing, and that's okay. As a matter of fact, it's necessary, because you're not going to get to that good writing until you have a draft on the page that you can then approach in a very critical manner and think about, how do I make this better? Because that's where good writing happens, is in that revision process. A couple of tools to have in your toolbox for doing this the first would be a literature review matrix. We do have this housed on the Online Campus Writing Center website. If you go into our resource pages, it's on the research writing resource page. A literature review matrix is just a spreadsheet. I recommend using Microsoft Excel for this, where you're going to have a row, and every row is going to correspond to a source that you are going to be putting into your literature review or your synthesized essay, and that you're taking notes. This is where you're taking your detailed notes. So for me, when I make a literature review matrix, what I do is I take notes on paper or in the margins of the article, and I then go and transpose those into my literature review matrix. That's a great dual purpose. One, when you've written them out by hand, one, you're more likely to recall them when you are writing out by hand. But then when you type them into a spreadsheet, you're doing more of that recall work. So you're really learning the information by writing about it in multiple platforms. The literature review matrix template that we have includes cells for all of the reference information from the article or from the source. You're going to take note of the authors, publication date, and so forth. But really the most important elements of this matrix happen in these later columns here, where you can see I've got my analysis. What are the strengths and weaknesses? What's cut out here, it didn't fit on my slide, is a column for how is this relating to the other sources. And then I think one of the most critical columns is going to be thematically, where is this fitting into my outline? Right, so this is where you begin to build your outline. I would say, is this going to appear in my introduction? Is this going to be part of like my first main point, second main point, third main point, that you're beginning to now build your outline within this literature review matrix. So again, you're writing across, and then when it comes down to time to actually write your essay, you're going to be reading down these columns, saying, okay, what information did I want to put where? This is where you can really become a puzzle master, right? So you're taking all these little pieces that you already have, and now you're going to put them into a cohesive whole. Now, some folks are really anti-spreadsheet. I understand that. We also have tools like the concept maps, right? So it's a very similar concept, but some folks just really prefer a much more visual representation of what it is they're trying to do. So a concept map might be a good alternative if you are not a spreadsheet person. Next tool, as I mentioned, I'm going to probably say it multiple times again this evening, is that you must work from an outline. Okay, that before you begin writing, you really need to have an outline. What you see here is just an example of what an outline might look like. This is an outline that is using APA heading levels, right? I've got my introduction, my research strategy, two required components of a chapter 2 or a literature review and a Chicago school dissertation. From there, you do have some leeway on how the body of your literature review is pulled together. This is really up to you. It's you as the expert are the ones who gets to say, here's how I consider the most logical presentation of content. So you're going to be organizing all of this content the way you think is most logical for your reader, and to build to that argument. Remember, you're trying to persuade your reader, your audience, that there is a gap in the literature that you will fill. So how are you going to build that? How are you going to make that case to your reader? You can help yourself out here. I recommend putting the outline in correct APA headings so that you understand the hierarchy of information, right? So you want to make sure you understand what is a main point, what is a sub point to that main point. So you have that hierarchy of information set out for you right away. I also recommend as you begin to build in this outline, you're going to start to have bullet points. Maybe you're even putting direct quotes in here or beginning to paraphrase that. As you do that, as you begin to fill out this outline, that you cite everything so that you don't commit accidental plagiarism where you've maybe you've copied text from an article and plugged it into your outline because you really want to remember to put it in that section, and then you forget what source you pulled that from, right? So make sure you're just putting those citations in as you're going through that process as well. All right, I'm going to pause for just a moment to see if there's any questions. It does not look like there are. So we have an outline. And just to reiterate, one thing I want to go back and point out in my outline here is you notice that as we get into the body what would be the main body paragraphs or narrative part of my literature review, that it's organized thematically, right? So my conceptual framework, I've got a couple of theories I'm pulling in. Then my next concept is going to be history of on-the-job training programs, and I'm going in there. So you notice it's organized thematically, that nowhere in my headings is there mention of any specific article. As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the traps that we see students falling into is really relying very heavily on what they've built to that point, which is a really robust annotated bibliography, and relying on that too heavily to build out their literature review. Because although you have a lot of content in that annotated bibliography that will likely appear in your literature review, it cannot be organized by article. It cannot be organized one paragraph about this source, the next paragraph about this source. A true synthesis, a true literature review is organized thematically. All right, so this is just a visual representation of that outline. So again, if you are someone who needs to map it out in a more visual way, think about, if we say issue 1 is, main idea 1, and here's all the articles that contribute to that theme that I identified. Issue B, second theme that's appearing in my essay, and here's all the sources that contributed to the development of that theme. Issue C would be the third theme that's in my literature review, and here's all the sources that contributed to that theme. But I'm organizing it centrally around that theme, not around the articles themselves. So that is the critical difference, is that you're able to sort of separate. You have to break apart all of those wonderful annotations, all those paragraphs that's really wonderfully summarize a source. You sort of need to take a hammer to them and smash them apart and put them together again with all of the other information that you smashed apart. So again, we have summary. And I know I've thrown around words, summary, paraphrase, so forth. So let's just take a minute, make sure we understand really what these are. So summary, again, that's your annotation. It's an overview. It's in your own words. So, we're not pulling huge block quotes. It's in your own words and your own sentence structure about important information from the source. Then you have what's called a paraphrase. So a paraphrase, also in your own words, is articulation in your own words, also your own sentence structure, right? So you can't just take a sentence and use your thesaurus and change a few words. That's still plagiarism. It's your own words, your own sentence structure of an important page, section, paragraph, or idea in another source. So when we paraphrase, what we do is we hone in on one very, very specific thing from our summary. And then paraphrasing goes a little bit further too. When we paraphrase, we then also add in a little bit of analysis and a little bit of our connection to the other information. So in summary is very isolated about a single source, but in paraphrase is where we now have an opportunity to connect ideas. That I might be paraphrasing information from two different sources in the same sentence. Right? And then synthesis, again, is harmonizing this. It's an important summarized or paraphrased information transformed into a new interpretation, resulting in your greater understanding of the topic and as well as your reader's greater understanding of the topic. So you're combining ideas to convey how the stronger and weaker literature interact with one another. So just to reiterate again a little bit more, your annotation again is a recap of the main points of a source or sources, a brief statement or restatement of a source's main points. You're explaining, you're describing. These are lower order, what we call lower order actions, where you summarize, explain, describe, represent. But in synthesis, we go into what's called higher order action or critical thought action. We're integrating, we're forming a complex whole, all right, we're analyzing, evaluating, and so forth. I've heard that synthesis is often likened to mental gymnastics. You're combining elements of separate material, again, to create a uniform concept. On the page, what does it look like? So I'm going to go back to that common trap that we see students often falling into, where their literature review just reads very much like an annotated bibliography, again, without the reference citations in there. And this is what that might look like, obviously in a very condensed, simplified example. But if we say we would have 3 paragraphs, maybe comprising a section of the literature review, and paragraph 1 is about one article, paragraph 2 is about a second article, and paragraph 3 is about a third article. So you see I've cited in each paragraph just one article. That's not synthesis. So that's a string of annotations. What synthesis looks like is how we meld all 3, the information from all 3 of those sources into one idea, right? So in this case, the topic is studies of undergraduate students have revealed conflicting conclusions. So if we go back, I know I didn't read these, but each of these is saying something very different about undergraduate students. All right, so the theme that we're drawing on, the main idea that we draw on that is I say, okay, I have 3 different articles. They all say something different about undergraduate students. So what am I taking out of that? What I'm taking out of that is that previous research has revealed conflicting conclusions regarding the relationship between advanced scholarly study and citation efficacy. Right, so that's what I've taken out, is that there's no agreement. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that there isn't agreement on here. And you notice how that's now leading maybe to a gap, to say maybe I need to do something to find agreement, to fill this, to solve this issue, right? So although Franz found this, Goldstein determined that, although Perez noted this, Franz's study was larger, more diverse. So notice how I'm using these sources to really build on that main idea that identified across all 3 of them. That is what true synthesis is, and what it looks like on the page too, where, if you're concerned, have I synthesized? If you find you've got paragraphs where you're citing one source over and over, then you go into another paragraph, you've cited a separate source over and over, but you don't have this interplay of sources, likely you haven't quite achieved that synthesis. So another way I like to think about this is to imagine yourself at a dinner party. Right? And you don't know very many people at this dinner party personally. However, you've heard of almost all of these people. These are the sort of preeminent or dominant researchers in your field. And you are a graduate student. You've been invited to this party with all of the premier sort of experts and researchers in your field, but you've not yet met any of them, and they have no idea who you are. So what happens when we walk into this party, right? It's a crowded room, and you notice people are talking to one another. There are conversations that are happening, but you're not part of that conversation. So what your role is in this literature review, your role in crafting a literature review and synthesizing the information is to prove to your peers, because I want you to now consider yourself a peer, a colleague of those, even the most published researchers and academics in your field, that you should consider yourself a colleague of theirs, right? But they don't know who you are yet. And so you need to prove that you are an equal player in this, I don't want to call it a game, but in this field, that you are somebody who has a voice, that you are a legitimate, credible academic practitioner who has something to say and wants to be included in this dinner party. What we don't do is we don't just barge in and start talking and taking over the conversation. We don't interrupt. We don't pretend like we know what we're talking about to fit in. If you really want to do this in a very critical way that's going to gain you credibility, is that you're going to go in and you're going to begin to listen to the conversations. Right? So I'm listening to what this group over here is saying. Now I'm going to go listen to what this group is over here is saying. Now I'm going to walk across the room and I'm going to listen to what this group is saying. And I'm going to begin from all of those, that listening, that active listening, I'm going to begin to formulate my own thoughts and my own perspective and point of view. And when I feel ready, when I feel like I can accurately represent what everybody else has said, right, where I can step into the conversation and be up to date and on point, that's when I join the conversation. So if you think about what is the point of doing a literature review, that's the point. Doing the literature review brings you into this conversation and puts you on that sort of level playing ground with everybody else who's in that conversation. It's my little dinner party analogy. You're establishing your expertise before you join the conversation. You're seeking relationships between the sources or between the people themselves, right? The researchers. You're avoiding, but you're not forcing that relationship. Okay, you have to also be willing to say, hey, that group over there having a separate conversation maybe doesn't play a role in my logical development of my story. You have to have a good rationale for not including that, but to understand that that's okay to not include information if it doesn't fit in. So you're finding relationships that are interesting, but they're relevant to your study, your focus. Remember, you're persuading us of something very specific. So some tips, some takeaways, as you're writing this synthesized essay, literature review or otherwise, make sure you're avoiding that over-reliance on a single source, right? Don't give a single source more credit than another source might deserve, right? Sometimes it's necessary. There are certainly scholars who publish very prolifically in particular fields. And if you have a very narrow focus, that might be the case, but make sure you're giving weight to other researchers as well. You are avoiding presenting information in quotation strings. Really tap into that, your ability. That's why we spend so much time being able to critically understand what we've read so that we can talk about it in our own words, right? When I see strings of quotes, direct quote after direct quote after direct quote, or block quotes, there is a part of me that thinks, well, maybe this writer didn't fully understand what he or she read, and that's why they are relying so heavily on direct quotes. So you don't want your reader to come away with that feeling. And don't be hesitant to assert an argument. Remember, you are connecting the research. You have a purpose. Your research questions and your purpose should be forefront in your mind when you're crafting this essay. Okay, I know students who will write their research questions on a sticky note and put it on their computer so that they're always there. They always have that guiding purpose, right? That this is the intention I have. This is the argument I'm trying to build, or the case I'm trying to make. You also want to make sure that you are not you're not, again, forcing that relationship. So I talked about that in the dinner party analogies. You don't want to force that relationship. You don't want to force two people to have a conversation if they shouldn't be having a conversation. You don't want to inaccurately introduce two people, right? That's really embarrassing to do. And transitional words can do that, can inaccurately sort of connect two concepts, right? So the word however should not be used unless you're presenting a really true contradiction. Unless, you know, point A really is contradicting point B, you should not have the word however. The words thus and therefore should be reserved for drawing a really true conclusion, right? You should not be using them in every paragraph because not every paragraph is drawing a conclusion. So you really want to make sure you're being very intentional with how you're using transitional words. You're not forcing those relationships. Again, you also want to make sure you're using words deliberately. So if you say that one author agrees with another, make sure that that's true, right? Don't just put it in there because it helps the paragraph flow a little bit. I will see often that, like, let's just say, we'll say like Marshall, 2008 noted such and such. And then the next sentence might say, and Cook expanded on Marshall's research, but the citation for Cook is previous to the year that Marshall published, right? So so the years of publication matter when you're thinking about how to connect these articles. So can you really say an author agreed with somebody if they published their work before that person, Right, so think about that word choice quite a bit. You also want to make sure that you're showing, not telling. So showing means that you're really engaging those sources in your paragraph. So if you find that all you're doing is one parenthetical citation after the next, or you have blocks of quotes that aren't cited, that you're just sort of regurgitating information, that's something we want to avoid doing. So really making sure that you're incorporating those sources into your narrative, right? Make sure you really show to your reader how they connect to one another. You also want to try to avoid sounding smart, right? If you've done your due diligence, you've done your work, and you really understand what you've read and what you're talking about, you're going to sound smart, right? So we don't want to overwrite. Right, so sometimes we see, and when I'm teaching this session in person, I'll always ask my students, raise your hand if you have ever read something and after you finish a paragraph or two, have no idea what you just read. Right? And then you try to reread it and you still have no idea what you just read. So maybe perhaps it sounds like this paragraph. So the move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways, to view a hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure. I could go on and on, but first of all, the sentence is very long. It's very confusing. It's not necessarily all that logical either. But how many times have you read something like this and you begin to question yourself, like maybe I'm just not quite to the point where I'm able to understand what this person is saying. I think that's not true. I think that that's bad writing. All right. So if you as a reader, remember, if you're trying to be overly complicated so that you sound smart, really what you're doing is you're alienating a good number of readers who would otherwise probably take great pleasure in reading a very smart, concise, simple essay that successfully synthesizes ideas. So don't do that overwriting. A few other synthesis tips. Remember, the author who is frugal with words not only writes a more readable manuscript, but also increases the chance that that manuscript will be accepted for publication. Short and to the point. Okay, you want to leave out irrelevant observations, your opinion, embellishments, and so forth. All right. You want to make sure you say only what needs to be said. Here's just a couple of sentence level tips to help with this. And I'm just bringing up some of our most common. So you don't need any I statements in anytime you're synthesizing. Yes, you again are conveying your own perspective, but you don't want the I, the personal, on the page. Okay, you're using evidence and analysis to present your perspective. So we don't need the I in there. We also generally don't need lengthy introductory phrases like in their research study, so-and-so found, or in a research study, their research showed, right? If you're citing the source, the implication is that it's research. So you don't need to say that. Try to avoid the it is important or there are many, those wordy phrases, we call them expletive phrases. Just get straight to the point. Always be straight to the point. Remember, your citation does a lot to tell the reader what you need to convey. We also want to, as much as possible, and again, this is all happening in your revision process. I don't want you to leave the session tonight thinking like, oh my goodness, I have to change the way I write. Don't change the way you write, change the way you revise your writing. Right? So if you find that you're somebody who tends to rely on wordy phrases, that's fine. Be as wordy as you want to be in that first draft. That's fine. But as you revise, think, how can I tighten this up? Right? How can I make sure that my reader is more focused on the content, the meat and potatoes, than on the fluff, the extra words that I'm putting in my sentence? Just a few other examples. So how can I make sure I'm not being redundant, that I'm not being wordier than I need to be? I do want to reiterate too, this presentation and recording will be available. I also have a lot of this content on our website, so don't feel panicked if you want to write down some of these common phrases. They are available on other platforms and the recording will be available as well. So much like we want to be sort of frugal with our words, we also want to be clear and we want to be precise. That means, unfortunately, if there are creative writers listening, that we have to abandon some of those creative writing tricks and techniques that we use, like setting up ambiguity, analogy, metaphor, because those just tend to confuse your readers of scientific prose. So we're aiming for simple, logical communication. That again, that's not always easy to do, but it takes practice. It happens during revision, not during your drafting stage. So that is the end of tonight's slides. I am happy to stay on for a few minutes if there are any questions. Otherwise, if you think of anything after the fact, our email is onlinewritingcenter@thechicagoschool.edu. This is our email address here, or I'm sorry, our web address here, and I'm going to take you quickly over to our website. I do want to make sure if you have not yet had an opportunity to make an appointment with the Writing Center that you know how to do so. This is our main page, the Online Campus Writing Center. To make an appointment, you're going to click Writing Reviews. We do recommend that you read our tips for making the most of your time with the Writing Center professional. We have step-by-step instructions for how to submit your paper, and the link to do so is right here as well. So again, thank you for your time this evening, and do reach out if you have any questions.